The morning mist clung to the apple orchards of Normandy like a damp, gray shroud, muffling the distant rumble of artillery that never seemed to fully cease. Here at Advanced Landing Ground 14, carved hastily into the mud just outside the village of Cretville, the war felt like a strange hybrid of a camping trip and an industrial assembly line. The air did not smell of apples or the summer harvest. It smelled of high-octane aviation fuel, wet canvas, and the acrid smoke of cheap tobacco. Captain Laurence Blumer, known to every man in the 367th Fighter Group as Scrappy, stood on the edge of the steel plank runway, chewing on the sodden end of a cigar. He watched the ground crew swarm over the twin-boomed shape of his P-38 Lightning. The aircraft, a massive piece of aluminum engineering, looked predatory even while sitting still. On its nose, painted with the care of a Renaissance master, but the subject matter of a dirty magazine, was a naked woman with a strategically placed banner reading "Censored." Beneath the cockpit, the name Scrap Iron 4 was stenciled in bold letters. It was his fourth mount, the previous three having been sacrificed to the unforgiving gods of flak and mechanical failure. Blumer adjusted his flight jacket, feeling the damp chill of the French morning seep through the leather. He was a man who seemed larger than his physical frame, possessing a kinetic energy that had once led him to take on two Marines in a fistfight back in the States, a brawl that had earned him his nickname and the grudging respect of a commanding officer who preferred fighters to diplomats. But here, in the mud of northern France, the fight was different. It was a grind. The base itself was a marvel of temporary permanence. The runway was made of pierced steel planking, a Hessian mat that clattered and banged with a deafening metallic racket every time a jeep or a plane rolled over it. To the side, the ruins of the Château de Francoteau loomed like a broken tooth, a constant reminder that they were squatting in the wreckage of someone else's history. The pilots lived in tents pitched in the mud, sleeping on cots that smelled of mildew, waiting for the weather to clear or the telephone to ring. Life on the ground was a battle against boredom and biology. Just an hour earlier, Blumer had sat in the mess tent, staring down at a tin tray of sea rations. It was ham and lima beans again, a culinary offense that the United States Army seemed to possess in infinite supply. But the beans were not the primary enemy. The yellow jackets were. The aggressive wasps were everywhere, drawn to the food with a persistence that rivaled the Luftwaffe. Men ate with one hand shoveling food and the other waving frantically, a synchronized dance of irritation that had become as much a part of the morning ritual as the briefing. "You think they know we're winning, Scrappy?" Lieutenant William Autry asked, walking up beside him. The South Carolinian was soft-spoken, a stark contrast to Blumer's boisterous nature. Autry looked out at the fog, his hands tucked into his pockets. Blumer shifted the cigar to the other side of his mouth. The Yellow Jackets or the Germans? Either one. The Wasps don't give a damn, Bill. And the Germans? Blumer narrowed his eyes, looking toward the east. The Germans are quiet. Too quiet. It was late August 1944. The Allies were breaking out, the armored columns of the First and Third Armies pushing hard toward Paris. The Luftwaffe, the once terrifying force that had ruled the skies of Europe, had become a ghost. They appeared only in spasms, striking and vanishing, leaving the American pilots with itchy trigger fingers and a dangerous sense of complacency. The Dynamite Gang, as the group called itself, had spent weeks blasting trains and strafing retreating columns, turning the beautiful French countryside into a junkyard of burning steel. But the air-to-air fight, the nightly duel that every fighter pilot secretly craved, had been elusive. Blumer walked over to Scrap Iron 4, his boots squelching in the mud. He ran a gloved hand along the leading edge of the wing. This machine was the fork-tailed devil, as the enemy called it. Unlike the single-engine Mustangs or Thunderbolts, the Lightning was a complex beast. It didn't have a control stick between the pilot's knees. It had a yoke, like a bomber or a luxury sedan, giving the pilot the illusion of driving rather than flying. But there was nothing luxurious about it. It was a weapons platform designed to kill. He climbed up the ladder and settled into the cockpit. The space was tight, smelling of oil, sweat, and leather. He began his pre-flight ritual, his hands moving with practiced fluidity over the switches and dials. He checked the magnetos, the fuel mixture, the oxygen flow, the turbo superchargers, which gave the Lightning its high-altitude performance, meant the engines didn't roar with a sharp bark like the other fighters. They hummed with a deep, throat-vibrating bass that you felt in your chest more than you heard with your ears. "All clear," the crew chief shouted from the mud below. Blumer gave a thumbs up. The twin 1,600 horsepower engines caught, and settled into a rhythmic idle. The propellers, counter-rotating to cancel out the torque, blurred into invisible discs of violence. As the vibrations traveled up through the seat and into his spine, Blumer felt the familiar transformation take hold. On the ground, he was just a man who hated lima beans and swatted at wasps. Here, strapped into 5 tons of aluminum and guns, he was something else. He released the brakes and taxied toward the end of the strip. The steel planking rattled violently beneath the landing gear, a cacophony of metal on metal that shook his teeth. Ahead of him, the rest of the 393rd Squadron lined up, a procession of twin-tailed shapes silhouetted against the lifting gray mist. The mission board in the briefing tent had been clear, a dive-bombing run on Luftwaffe airfields near Leon. They were hauling 2,000-pound bombs, heavy loads that made the nimble fighters sluggish and vulnerable. It was supposed to be a milk run. Smash the runways, strafe the hangars, and be back in time for whatever canned mystery meat the cooks were opening for dinner. But as Blumer lined up for takeoff, pushing the throttles forward and feeling the surge of power press him back into the seat, a prickle of unease sat at the base of his neck. The intelligence report said the enemy was broken, retreating, finished. Yet, looking out over the scarred landscape of France as his wheels left the rattling steel and bit into the smooth air, Blumer couldn't shake the feeling that the ghost was about to manifest. The sky was too big, too empty, and entirely too inviting. "Red flight, form up." Blumer's voice crackled over the radio, sharp and businesslike. "Let's get this done." They climbed through the breaking cloud layer, rising into the brilliant, blinding blue of the upper atmosphere, leaving the mud and the wasps behind. Up here, everything was clean and cold, but Blumer kept his head on a swivel, his eyes scanning the horizon, hunting for the specks that would turn a routine morning into a fight for survival. The war wasn't over yet, no matter what the newspapers back home said, and Scrappy Blumer was ready to punch back. The formation of P-38 Lightnings hung suspended in the sky above the patchwork quilt of northern France, a dozen silver crosses drifting against a backdrop of aggressive blue. To an observer on the ground, they might have looked serene, small specks moving with lazy purpose. Inside the cockpit of Scrap Iron 4, however, the reality was a deafening, vibrating struggle against physics. Captain Laurence "Scrappy" Blumer wrestled with the yoke, feeling the heaviness of the aircraft in his forearms. Today, his beloved fighter was not a Greyhound, it was a mule. Slung beneath the wings were 2 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs, turning the sleek twin-engine interceptor into a sluggish beast that wallowed in the thin air. The mission briefing at Crédiville had been standard fare, delivered by an intelligence officer who pointed at maps with a stick and spoke of strategic necessity while the pilots fought off sleep and digestion. The targets were the Luftwaffe airfields clustered around Leon, Claustre, and Peronne. The Germans were retreating, pulling back toward the Reich, and the job of the 367th Fighter Group was to kick them while they were down, smashing hangars and cratering runways to ensure nothing fueled up to harass the advancing Allied armies. "Red leader to red flight." Blumer's voice moved through the throat microphone, fighting the static. "Target area in 5 mics. Check your switches. Let's make this clean." "Red 2, roger," came the calm, drawling reply of Lieutenant Bill Autry on his wing. Blumer glanced to his right. Autry was tucked in tight, his props spinning in a mesmerizing blur. There was a comfort in seeing him there, a tangible anchor in the vastness of the sky. But beneath the professional veneer, Blumer felt the familiar itch of frustration. He was a fighter pilot, trained to hunt, to duel, to spiral through the clouds in a high-speed chess match. Hauling high explosives to drop on concrete felt like manual labor. It was necessary, dangerous work. Flak didn't care if you were a fighter or a bomber, but it lacked the visceral clarity of air-to-air combat. The landscape below rolled by, a blur of greens and browns, interrupted by the jagged scars of bomb craters and the dark lines of roads clogged with the debris of war. Blumer checked his altitude, 12,000 feet. The air was thin and cold, frosting the edges of the canopy, contrasting sharply with the sweat pooling under his flight gear. The heating system in the P-38 was notoriously temperamental, usually offering a choice between freezing to death or roasting alive. Today, it seemed to have chosen a damp, humid middle ground. "Target sighted," Blumer muttered to himself, spotting the geometric shapes of the cluster's airfield. Arming bombs. He flipped the switches, the mechanical clicks audible even over the drone of the twin Allisons. The tension in the cockpit ratcheted up. This was the moment of vulnerability. To deliver the ordnance, they had to commit to a dive, steadying the aircraft in a predictable line, making themselves perfect targets for whatever flak gunners were left down there. Rolling in, Blumer announced. He tipped the heavy nose of scrap iron 4 forward. The horizon tilted and vanished, replaced by the rushing ground. The airspeed indicator wound up, the needle trembling as gravity and horsepower combined. The moan of the wind rushing over the canopy grew to a shriek. The airfield expanded rapidly in his gun sight. Hangars, a control tower, the long strip of runway. At 3,000 feet, the ground rushed up to meet him with terrifying speed. Blumer thumbed the release button. The aircraft bucked violently, leaping upward as 2,000 pounds of dead weight fell away. "Bombs away! Pulling up!" He hauled back on the yoke, the G-forces crushing him into the seat, graying the edges of his vision. He grunted against the pressure, his G-suit inflating to squeeze the blood back into his brain. As he leveled off, he craned his neck to look back. Immense geysers of dirt and debris erupted along the hangar line. Secondary explosions bloomed, orange fireballs rolling mixed with black smoke. "Good hits, Red Leader," Autry's voice came through, sounding satisfied. The rest of the squadron followed suit, a conveyor belt of destruction. Within minutes, the airfield was a smoking ruin. The flak had been sporadic, light puffs of black smoke that trailed uselessly behind them. It was, as predicted, a milk run. "All right, boys," Blumer said, banking the flight back toward the west, toward the safety of the lines and the promise of a drink that wasn't lukewarm water. "Let's head for the barn. Drinks are on me if you can beat me back." The tension began to bleed out of the cockpit. Shoulders relaxed. The hum of the engines sounded less like a growl and more like a lullaby. The mission was effectively over. They were just bus drivers now, ferrying empty planes back to base. Blumer reached for his pocket, patting the cigars he kept there, mentally calculating how long until he could light one. The radio crackled, not the rhythmic static of background interference, but the jagged, high-pitched urgency of a man shouting into his mask. "Mayday! Mayday! This is White Leader. We are jumped! Bandits! Bandits everywhere! Sector 3-5. I repeat, we are heavily engaged." The voice belonged to Major Grover Gardner, leading the 394th Squadron. It was a sound that turned the blood to ice water, the sound of controlled panic, the frequency of a man watching his friends die. Blumer sat bolt upright, the cigar forgotten. The relaxed posture of the milk run evaporated instantly. He checked his map. Gardner's flight was operating near the undiscovered airfields around Leon Athis, maybe 25 miles to the east. "Did you copy that, Scrappy?" Autry asked, the drawl gone, replaced by a tight, sharp tone. "I copied," Blumer snapped. He looked at his fuel gauges. They had enough. He looked at his ammo counters. Full. He looked at the empty pylons under his wings. The mule was gone. The Greyhound was back. But 25 miles was an eternity in an air war. It was 4 minutes of flight time. In 4 minutes, a squadron could be wiped out. Gardner had said bandits everywhere. That didn't mean a pair of stray Messerschmitts. That meant a swarm. "Red flight, drop tanks if you got 'em," Blumer ordered, though they were already flying clean. "Pivot 180, we're going hunting." He banked Scrap Iron 4 hard to the left, the twin tails slicing through the air. The G-forces hit him again, but this time he welcomed them. It was the feeling of momentum shifting. The 12 P-38s behind him mimicked the move, a synchronized school of sharks turning toward the scent of blood. "Okay, let's pour on the coal," Blumer growled into the mic. He jammed the throttles forward to the stops, engaging the war emergency power. The turbo superchargers screamed, gulping down the thin air, and the manifold pressure gauges spiked. The aircraft surged, the frame shuddering as it clawed for more speed. As they closed the distance, the radio remained a chaotic mess of shouts, curses, and the terrible silence of unanswered calls. "Brake left! Brake left! There's 2 on your tail, Jimmy! I'm hit! I'm bailing out!" Blumer stared through the bullet-resistant glass of his windshield, his eyes straining against the glare of the sun. He needed altitude. Altitude was life. He pulled the nose up, trading some of his airspeed for height, aiming to arrive above the fight. And then he saw it. It looked like a disturbed hornet's nest kicked by a giant boot. Below them, at roughly 8,000 feet, the sky was a swirling, confused mass of metal. There were dozens of aircraft, far too many to be just Gardner's flight. The dark, short-nosed silhouettes of Focke-Wulf 190s were everywhere, diving, climbing, and rolling. Tracers stitched patterns of smoke through the air, weaving a deadly net around the silver shapes of the desperate P-38s. "Good Lord," Autry breathed over the channel. "There must be 50 of them." 40 at least, Blumer corrected, his mind rapidly cataloging the scene. It was the second group of Jagdgeschwader 6, a premier Luftwaffe unit. They had likely been relocating, caught in transit, but with overwhelming numbers. They had the numbers, they had the surprise, and they were currently butchering the 394th. Blumer felt a cold, hard clarity settle over him. The fear of the flak, the boredom of the flight, the annoyance of the beans, it all vanished. The world narrowed down to the reflector sight in front of him and the throttle in his left hand. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was a kinetic equation of energy and mass, about to introduce a violent variable into the German calculations. He checked his position. They were high, 10,000 feet, with the sun at their backs. The classic tactical advantage. The Germans below were fixated on the kill, chasing the scattering 394th, unaware that the hammer was about to fall. "Pick your targets," Blumer said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Follow me down." He pushed the yoke forward. The nose of Scrap Iron 4 dropped, pointing straight into the heart of the swarm. The airspeed indicator wound past 400 miles per hour. The hum of the engines became a shriek. The airframe vibrated with the stored potential of violence. Blumer wasn't thinking about medals or history or the folks back in North Dakota. He was watching a single FW-190 that was latching onto the tail of a crippled Lightning. He adjusted his grip on the wheel, his thumb hovering over the trigger button on the yoke. The preparation was over. The tension had snapped. The dive had begun. The dive was a physical assault. The altimeter unwound in a blur, the needle spinning backward as Scrap Iron 4 plummeted from 10,000 feet. The screaming whine of the twin superchargers rose to a shriek that penetrated the leather of Blumer's flight helmet, vibrating against his skull. The airspeed indicator trembled past 450 miles per hour, the controls stiffening in his hands as the air thickened, turning the fluid atmosphere into something solid and resistant. Below him, the unsuspecting Focke-Wulf 190 was a mottled gray cross against the green tapestry of France. It was fixated on a trailing P-38 from the 394th Squadron, the German pilot lining up a kill, unaware that he had just become the prey. Blumer did not feel fear. He did not feel the cold sweat of the morning or the lingering taste of the bitter coffee. The world had contracted to the glowing ring of the Lin optical gun sight, and the gray metal of the enemy fighter growing rapidly in the glass. This was the mathematics of murder, executed at 300 feet per second. "Eat this, you son of a bitch," Blumer grunted, his voice lost in the roar. At 400 yards, he squeezed the trigger button on the yoke. The nose of the lightning erupted. Unlike the wing-mounted guns of the Mustangs or Thunderbolts, which required the pilot to calculate a convergence point where the bullet streams met, the P-38's armament was clustered in the central nacelle, directly in front of the pilot. It was a sawed-off shotgun and a sniper rifle combined, 4 50-caliber machine guns, and the centerline 20mm Hispano cannon fired in a straight, devastating line. The airframe shuddered violently as the recoil slowed the dive. Tracers, bright and lethal, lashed out, connecting instantly with the Focke-Wulf's fuselage. There was no sparring, no dancing. The German fighter simply disintegrated. The 20mm shells tore the right wing from the root, sending the enemy plane spinning into a violent, fiery cartwheel. Debris, shreds of aluminum, plexiglass, and burning oil flew backward into Blumer's slipstream. He hauled back on the yoke with both hands, his biceps straining. The pullout was brutal. Gravity slammed him down into the bucket seat, a giant invisible hand crushing his chest, forcing the air from his lungs. His vision grayed at the edges, tunneling down to a pinprick of light. The G-suit bladders around his legs and abdomen inflated instantly, squeezing him hard to keep the blood in his brain, preventing a blackout. Scrap Iron 4 groaned under the stress, but held, the twin booms flexing as the fighter converted its massive kinetic energy back into altitude. He shot upward, a silver arrow defying gravity, leaving the burning wreckage far below. "Scratch 1!" Blumer yelled, the adrenaline hitting his bloodstream like a shot of Benzedrine. But as he crested the top of his zoom climb, hanging for a moment in the weightlessness of the apex, the true scale of the nightmare revealed itself. The sky was not just occupied, it was infested. The initial dive had punched a hole in the enemy formation, but now the hive had been kicked. To his left, a flight of 4 FW-190s broke formation, their radial engines smoking as they banked hard to engage him. To his right, tracers zipped past in lazy, glowing arcs that snapped into terrifying speed as they whipped by his canopy. The radio was a cacophony of panicked shouts and static. "Brake right! Brake right! 6 o'clock! They're all over us! Where the hell is the support? I'm hit! Oil pressure dropping!" It was chaos, absolute, unadulterated bedlam. The neat tactical diagrams of flight school meant nothing here. This was a barroom brawl in 3 dimensions. The air smelled of cordite and high-octane exhaust, sucked in through the vents, a metallic, acrid taste that coated the back of Blumer's throat. "Stay with me, Bill," Blumer shouted, checking his mirror. Lieutenant Autry was there, a faithful shadow, his P-38 hanging off Blumer's right wing, struggling to match the violent energy changes. "I'm here, Scrappy, but it's getting thick." Blumer rolled the Lightning over on its back, looking down through the top of the canopy at the swirling melee below. The Germans were recovering from the shock. The FW-190 was a dangerous opponent, smaller, lighter, and with a roll rate that the heavy twin-engine P-38 couldn't hope to match. If Blumer tried to turn with them horizontally, he was a dead man. His advantage was power. Pure, brute horsepower. He spotted a second target, a Focke-Wulf climbing to get a bead on a P-38 that was trailing smoke. The German was focused, tunnel-visioned on the kill. "Going down again," Blumer announced, and he pulled the nose through the horizon, entering a split S maneuver. The world spun. Sky became ground. The engines roared as the props bit into the air. He fell upon the second German like a sledgehammer. The enemy pilot must have sensed the shadow falling over him because he broke hard to the left, banking his wings vertical to tighten the turn. It was a 40-degree deflection shot. A high-difficulty angle that required the shooter to fire into empty space, trusting the enemy to fly into the bullets. Blumer didn't calculate it. He felt it. It was the same hand-eye coordination that had made him a hunter in the North Dakota woods, the same instinct that guided a basketball into a hoop. He led the target, pulling the nose of the P-38 ahead of the turning German. He depressed the trigger. Thump, 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 thump. The heavy vibration of the cannon rattled his teeth. The stream of fire intersected the FW-190's flight path perfectly. The cowling of the German engine exploded. Smoke, black and oily, erupted instantly, blinding the pilot. The enemy plane shuddered, stalled, and fell away in a flat spin, looking like a broken toy. 2 down. But there was no time to celebrate. A stream of cannon shells hammered the air just feet from his left wingtip. Thwack, thwack. The sound was distinct, a sickening impact of metal on metal. Blumer flinched, instinctively stomping on the right rudder and jamming the yoke over. Scrap Iron 4 skidded through the air, spoiling the aim of the German on his tail. "Bandit on your 6, Scrappy!" "I got him!" Autry's voice screamed. Blumer looked back to see Autry's P-38 diving past him, guns blazing, forcing the attacking Focke-Wulf to break off. The sky was a swirling kaleidoscope of gray and silver, smoke and fire. There was no up or down anymore, only relative position. Below them, amidst the chaos, Feldwebel Fritz Buchholz of the second group of Jagdgeschwader 6 gripped his control stick with white knuckles. Minutes ago, he had been the hunter, part of a massive force sweeping the sky clean. Now, the world had inverted. The Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devils, were raining down on them. It wasn't fair. The Americans were supposed to be heavy, clumsy bombers. Instead, they were fighting like demons. Buchholz saw a P-38 pull out of a dive with terrifying speed, its twin booms glistening. He tried to bring his Focke-Wulf around, to use his superior roll rate to cut inside the American's turn. But the lightning didn't turn. It simply went up. It climbed vertically, riding pillars of engine thrust that the radial engine Focke-Wulf couldn't match. Buchholz watched helpless as the American hung in the air, pivoted on a wingtip, and came back down. The hunter became the hunted. Back in the cockpit, Blumer was sweating profusely. His flight suit was soaked, sticking to his back. The physical exertion was immense, wrestling the heavy yoke, twisting his neck constantly to check his 6, fighting the crushing G-forces that drained his strength with every turn. His breath came in ragged gasps, amplified by the oxygen mask. Climb, dive, shoot. Climb, dive, shoot. It was a rhythm, a deadly dance. He couldn't stay level. Level was death. He had to keep the energy up. Bandits at 3 o'clock. Hi! Blumer saw them. A pair of FW-190s diving on a lone P-38 that was limping home with a feathered prop. The injustice of it flared in his chest. "Not today, Fritz," Blumer snarled. He hauled Scrap Iron 4 around, demanding more from the airframe than Lockheed had ever intended. The metal groaned, a high-pitched complaint of stressed rivets. He cut across the diameter of the circle, cheating the turn, aiming not for where the Germans were, but where they had to go. He caught the leader of the pair in a head-on pass. It was a game of chicken played at a closing speed of 800 miles per hour. The German fired first, his tracers whipping past Blumer's canopy like angry wasps. Blumer didn't flinch. He held the trigger down. The P-38's nose lit up with muzzle flashes. The wall of lead slammed into the Focke-Wulf. The collision of forces was catastrophic. The German plane didn't just break. It evaporated in a pink mist of atomized fuel and hydraulic fluid. Blumer flew right through the debris cloud, hearing the ping-ping-ping of shrapnel hitting his fuselage. 3! He yanked the fighter upward again, trading his terrifying speed for safety. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The noise of the battle was a constant dull roar, the engines, the guns, the wind. But inside his head, it was strangely quiet. There was only the next target. He scanned the sky. It was a junkyard of falling metal. Parachutes blossomed like white flowers in a field of gray smoke. Some were American, most were German. The 367th was fighting for its life, but they were giving better than they got. Blumer spotted a Focke-Wulf trying to disengage, diving toward the cloud deck, hoping to lose himself in the mist. It was a mistake. The lightning was faster in a dive. "Oh, no, you don't," Blumer whispered. He pushed the nose over. The descent was rapid. The compressibility buffeting shook the yoke in his hands, threatening to rip control away from him. He fought it, muscling the sight onto the fleeing gray shape. The German pilot jinked left, then right, desperate to shake the twin-tailed monster on his tail. Blumer waited. He waited for the zigzag to cross his center line. Patience. Patience. Now. He fired a short burst. The tracers stitched a line along the Focke-Wulf's fuselage. Smoke poured from the enemy's cockpit. The canopy flew off, and the small dark figure tumbled out, the parachute streaming behind him. 4, Blumer counted, his voice flat. He pulled up, leveling off at 6,000 feet. His arms ached. His neck felt like it was grinding on sand. He checked his fuel, burning fast. He checked his ammo, getting low. But the sky was still full of targets. The swarm was breaking up, losing its cohesion. The Germans were scattering, their formation shattered by the ferocity of the American counterattack. But there were still dangers. A lone wolf was always the most dangerous. "Red leader, check your 6." Autry's voice was urgent. Blumer craned his neck. A Focke-Wulf was slotting in behind him, close, too close. He could see the yellow spinner on the nose. He could see the muzzle flashes. Thump! A bullet punched through the floor of the cockpit, inches from his left boot. It tore through the plexiglass canopy with a sharp crack, showering him with plastic shards. The wind roared into the cockpit, louder than before, carrying the freezing cold of the upper air. Damn it! Blumer slammed the throttle forward to the stop, engaging the war emergency power once more. The engine screamed in protest. He hauled back on the yoke, going vertical, betting his life that his engines were stronger than the Germans. He climbed, straight up into the blinding sun, the G-forces crushing him, the world spinning, the blood rushing from his head. He was riding a rocket, suspended between the earth and the heavens, in a machine made of aluminum and will. The fight wasn't over. The 5th kill was out there, somewhere in the smoke, waiting for him. And Scrappy Blumer wasn't done yet. The frenetic, swirling madness of the dogfight began to unravel. Not all at once, but in pieces, like a heavy rope fraying under tension. The sky, which only moments ago had been a claustrophobic box filled with twisting metal and tracers, started to expand again. The remaining Focke-Wulfs, realizing that their ambush had turned into a massacre, were scattering, diving toward the hard deck or fleeing east into the haze of the afternoon sun. Captain Laurence Scrappy Blumer leveled the wings of Scrap Iron 4, his chest heaving against the restraints. The cockpit smelled of cordite, burnt oil, and the sour copper tang of his own fear and aggression. Sweat ran in rivulets down his back, pooling at the base of his spine, turning cold as the adrenaline began to recede, leaving him shivering in the drafty air at 8,000 feet. His hands, still gripping the yoke, trembled with a fine, high-frequency vibration that had nothing to do with the engines. He scanned the horizon, his eyes burning from the strain of searching for the enemy against the glare. The main body of the German force had broken. They were running. The initiative had shifted violently, decisively, back to the Americans. "Red leader, this is Red 2. Lieutenant Bill Autry's voice crackled in his ear, sounding breathless but miraculously calm. "I'm on your 4 o'clock, Scrappy. Looks like the party's breaking up." "Roger 2, Blumer rasped, his throat dry. He swallowed hard, trying to lubricate his vocal cords. "Keep your eyes peeled. Stragglers are dangerous." And then he saw him. Below, against the mottled green and brown of the French countryside, a single FW-190 was racing toward the safety of the cloud layer. The German pilot was flying low and fast, hugging the terrain, a gray wolf trying to slip back into the forest unnoticed. He was the last remnant of the swarm, the final piece of the chaotic puzzle that Blumer felt compelled to solve. Blumer checked his ammo counters. He was low, dangerously low. The 450 caliber machine guns had perhaps a few seconds of fire left between them. The 20mm cannon was likely down to its last dozen shells. A prudent pilot would have turned for home, grateful for survival and the 4 victories already notched on his belt. A prudent pilot would have remembered the fuel gauge, which was ticking steadily toward empty after 20 minutes of combat at war emergency power. But Scrappy Blumer was not feeling prudent. He was feeling a strange crystalline clarity, a hyperfocus that made the world slow down. This was the pilot's holiday, the day every aviator dreamed of but never truly expected to see. To leave one enemy behind felt incomplete. "I see one more, Bill," Blumer said. "Cover me." "I got you, Scrappy. Go get him." Blumer rolled the heavy lightning onto its back. For a split second, he hung suspended upside down, staring at the fleeing German 2,000 feet below. Then he pulled the yoke into his stomach. The nose of Scrap Iron 4 dropped. The twin booms sliced through the air as the fighter transitioned from a horizontal predator to a vertical one. It was a dive of pure aggression, executed with the precision of a raptor folding its wings. To Autry, watching from above, Blumer looked like a hawk falling upon a field mouse, direct, unwavering, and terrifyingly fast. The airspeed indicator wound up again, passing 400 miles per hour. The wind shrieked over the canopy, a banshee wail that drowned out the hum of the engines. The P-38, heavier than the single-engine German plane, gathered momentum like a falling anvil. The distance closed rapidly. 3,000 feet. 2,000. 1,000. The German pilot must have checked his mirror, or perhaps he simply felt the shadow of death falling over him. The Focke-Wulf jerked to the right, then broke hard to the left, a desperate flailing maneuver to spoil the American's aim. Blumer didn't follow the jink. He anticipated it. He made a minute correction with the rudder pedals, skidding the Lightning just enough to keep the pipper of his gun sight floating ahead of the enemy's nose. He was no longer thinking about deflection angles or ballistics. He was simply extending his will through the airframe. At 300 yards, Blumer squeezed the trigger. The vibration was brief. The guns chattered, a short controlled burst of everything he had left. The tracers lashed out, a converging stream of light that connected with the rear fuselage of the Focke-Wulf. The effect was instantaneous. Pieces of the German fighter's tail assembly flew off, glittering like confetti. Smoke, thick and white, poured from the engine cowling. The enemy plane shuddered violently, its aerodynamic integrity shattered. It rolled uncontrollably to the right, then snapped back to the left. Blumer pulled up, banking hard to avoid the debris, watching over his shoulder. He saw the canopy of the Focke-Wulf fly off, tumbling away into the slipstream. A second later, a small dark figure was ejected from the cockpit, tumbling through the air. Snap! A white circle blossomed against the dark earth, a parachute. The German pilot swung beneath the silk canopy, suspended and helpless, drifting slowly down toward the hedgerows of Normandy. His machine, now just a burning collection of metal, continued its death spiral until it impacted a field, erupting in a fountain of orange flame and black smoke. Blumer watched the parachute for a long moment. There was no desire to strafe the pilot, no lingering hatred. That man down there was no longer an enemy combatant. He was just a survivor, like Blumer. The violence of the last 15 minutes evaporated, replaced by a sudden, profound stillness. "Splash 5, Blumer whispered. The words felt strange in his mouth. "Did you see that?" Autry's voice broke the silence, filled with awe. "He bailed." "That's 5, Scrappy. That's an ace in a day." 5. The number hung in the cockpit. In the span of time it took to change the oil in a Jeep, Blumer had shot down 5 enemy aircraft. It was a statistical anomaly, a feat of luck and skill that defied the averages of aerial warfare. Most pilots went a whole tour without seeing 5 Germans, let alone destroying them. Blumer eased the throttles back. The screaming roar of the engines dropped to a throaty, rhythmic thrum. The silence that followed the cessation of the guns was deafening. The violent shaking of the airframe smoothed out. The world stopped vibrating. "Let's form up, Red Flight," Blumer said, his voice sounding older, heavier. "Let's go home." He circled once more, banking gently around the column of smoke rising from his final victim. The white parachute had landed. The German was likely already unbuckling his harness, preparing for captivity. It was over. The sky above was a brilliant, empty blue, indifferent to the carnage that had just taken place. As the adrenaline crash hit him, Blumer felt his knees begin to shake uncontrollably against the rudder pedals. His hands, gripping the yoke, were white-knuckled and cramped. He forced himself to open them, flexing his fingers, feeling the circulation return with a painful tingle. The sweat that had soaked his flight suit during the fight was now clammy and cold, making him shiver violently. He looked around. The other P-38s of the squadron were gathering, drawn back together like iron filings to a magnet. They emerged from the haze, sliding into formation one by one. Some were trailing wisps of smoke. Others had jagged holes in their wings or tails where flak and cannon shells had found their mark. But they were flying. The silhouette of the twin-tailed devils was a comforting geometry against the clouds. "Sound off," Blumer ordered. "Red 2, clean. Red 3, got a few holes, but she's flying. Red 4, barely enough gas to taxi, but I'm here." The roll call continued. They had taken hits. They had lost friends. The radio silence from the 394th told a grim story. But the unit had survived. They had flown into a trap and chewed their way out of it. Blumer adjusted the trim tabs, relieving the pressure on the yoke. Scrap Iron 4 was a good ship. She had taken him into the fire and brought him out the other side without a scratch. He patted the side of the cockpit affectionately. The flight back to Cretville was a strange, dreamlike journey. The tension of combat was replaced by the tension of survival. Every eye was glued to the fuel gauges. The needles were hovering near the empty mark. They leaned out the mixture, dropping the RPMs to the absolute minimum needed to stay airborne, gliding more than flying. Below them, the war on the ground continued. Columns of American armor kicked up dust on the roads, moving inexorably east. Puffs of artillery smoke marked the front lines. But up here, at 6,000 feet, there was a temporary peace. Blumer lit a cigar. His hands were still shaking enough that it took 2 tries with his lighter, the flame dancing erratically. He took a long drag, the harsh smoke filling his lungs, replacing the taste of fear with the taste of tobacco. It was the best cigar he had ever had. He looked over at Autry, flying off his right wing. Autry gave him a slow, deliberate salute. Blumer returned it, a small gesture between men who had just walked through a furnace together. The airfield at Cretville appeared on the horizon, a muddy scar in the green landscape. It was an ugly, miserable place, full of wasps and bad food, but right now, it looked like the Garden of Eden. "Cretville Tower, this is Red Leader," Blumer keyed the mic. "Inbound with the flight. We're running on fumes, so clear the deck."
"Roger, Red Leader. Welcome back,"
the controller replied. Even through the static, Blumer could hear the relief in the man's voice. They had been listening. They knew. As Blumer lined up for the approach, dropping his landing gear and feeling the familiar drag, he let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for an hour. The wheels touched the steel planking with a harsh screech, followed by the rumbling clatter that shook the entire airframe. It was a jarring, ungraceful return to Earth, but it was the sound of safety. He taxied to his hardstand, the engines sputtering as the last dregs of fuel were consumed. The props spun down to a halt. Silence, true, heavy silence, descended on the cockpit. Blumer sat there for a moment, unable to move. He was exhausted, drained of every ounce of energy. He looked at the instrument panel, at the gun switches now flipped to safe, at the empty sky above. He was an ace, a hero. the scourge of the Luftwaffe. But as he unbuckled his harness and prepared to climb out into the mud, all he felt was a profound, overwhelming gratitude that he would live to see the sunset. The turning point wasn't the fifth kill. It was the moment the noise stopped and he knew he was coming home. The silence that descended upon the cockpit of Scrap Iron 4 was heavier than the G-forces had been. The violent throbbing hum of the twin Allison engines, which had been the heartbeat of Laurence Blumer's existence for the last 2 hours, was replaced by the ticking of cooling metal. The propellers, once invisible discs of lethal potential, were now just static, bent blades of aluminum jutting into the damp French air. Blumer sat motionless for a long moment, his hands resting on his knees. His flight suit was soaked through with sweat that was rapidly turning cold, making him shiver uncontrollably. He felt drained, hollowed out, as if the adrenaline had scoured his insides clean of everything. Fear, anger, even relief. He was just a vessel of exhaustion. He unclipped his oxygen mask, the rubber peeling away from his face with a sticky sound, leaving deep red indentations on his cheeks. He took a breath of the ambient air. It smelled of wet earth, high-octane fuel, and the faint sweet rot of the nearby apple orchards. It was the smell of life. The canopy cranked open with a squeal. Below him, the mud of Advanced Landing Ground 14 was churning under the boots of running men. The ground crew, who had counted the returning planes and seen the blackened gun ports, were swarming the hardstand. "Captain! Captain!" his crew chief yelled, his face a mask of soot and excitement. "The boys are saying you got 5. Did you get 5? Blumer looked down at the kid. He looked impossibly young, like he should be delivering newspapers in Fargo, not wrenching on warplanes in Normandy. Blumer tried to speak, but his throat was parched. He simply held up his right hand, splaying 5 fingers. A roar went up from the ground, a collective shout of triumph that rolled across the steel planking. Mechanics threw their hats in the air. Someone was already painting a 5th swastika on the air in their mind. But as Blumer climbed stiffly out of the cockpit, his boots sliding in the muck, he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like an old man of 27. He walked around the nose of the P-38. He touched the painted nude woman on the nacelle, her censored banner now streaked with oil. The gun ports were black with soot. The paint on the leading edges of the wings was chipped. Scrap Iron 4 looked like a brawler who had gone 12 rounds and won by a knockout. But she wasn't pretty anymore. "Check the gun camera film," Blumer ordered quietly, handing his parachute harness to a waiting corporal. "And get her fueled. We might have to go back up." "Go back up? Sir, you just wiped them out," the chief said, beaming. "Just check the film," Blumer said, turning away. The debriefing tent was a scene of controlled chaos. The intelligence officers, usually calm men who dealt in maps and probabilities, were practically vibrating. The reports were coming in from the 394th and the 393rd. The numbers were staggering. The 367th Fighter Group, the Dynamite Gang, had flown into a trap, springing with superior numbers, and had utterly dismantled the trap. Later that evening, the pilots gathered in the makeshift cinema tent to watch the developed footage from the gun cameras. The room was dark, filled with the haze of cigarette smoke and the smell of damp wool. The projector whirred, casting a flickering cone of light onto a suspended bedsheet. On the screen, the violence was rendered in grainy, silent black and white. It was ghostly. There was no sound of roaring engines or tearing metal, only the mute testimony of light and shadow. The men watched as Blumer's film rolled. They saw the Focke-Wulf grow large in the frame. They saw the flashes of the hits. They saw the pieces fly off, a rudder here, a wingtip there. They saw the German pilot bail out, a small, dark rag doll tumbling into the void. "Jesus, Scrappy," Bill Autry whispered, sitting beside him. "It looks like a movie, like it isn't even real." "It was real enough," Blumer murmured, lighting a fresh cigar. The flame illuminated his face, highlighting the deep lines around his eyes. The final tally was written on the chalkboard at the front of the room. 16 German aircraft destroyed, 14 enemy pilots killed. It was a massacre. The second group of Jägerschwader 6 had effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit. But there was another column on the board, one that drew Blumer's eye repeatedly. 2 P-38s lost. 4 pilots bailed out over enemy territory. The victory had a price. While the mess tent erupted in celebration later that night, fueled by cases of captured German schnapps that General Patton himself had reportedly ordered distributed to the fighter groups, Blumer found his gaze drifting to the empty bunks in the corner of the sleeping quarters. The schnapps burned going down, a harsh, fiery liquid that did little to numb the reality. The men were loud, boasting of their deflections and their maneuvers, their voices rising to drown out the silence that the missing men had left behind. It was a defense mechanism, Blumer knew. You celebrated the kills because if you thought too hard about the losses, you wouldn't be able to climb back into the cockpit the next morning. To the dynamite gang, Major Gardner toasted, raising a tin cup. Best damn shooters in the ETO. Hear, hear, the room roared. Blumer raised his cup, but he didn't drink immediately. He thought of the German pilot floating down under the white silk. He thought of the American boys who were right now evading capture in the hedgerows, or worse, lying broken in the wreckage of their lightnings. The pilot's holiday was over. Tomorrow, the war would still be there. The beans would still be cold, the wasps would still be hungry, and the flak would still be lethal. In the weeks that followed, the magnitude of that day in August solidified into legend. The 367th received the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor a unit could achieve. Blumer himself stood at attention, while Lieutenant General Carl Spaatz pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to his chest. The citation spoke of extraordinary heroism and aggressive leadership. Blumer accepted the medal with the stoic face required of an officer. He shook the general's hand. He saluted. But inside, he felt the heavy weight of the medal against his heart, a tangible reminder of the chaotic 15 minutes that had defined his life. It was a strange alchemy, transforming terror and death into ribbons and bronze. The war ground on. Blumer continued to fly, leading his squadron through the freezing misery of the Battle of the Bulge, transitioning to the single-engine P-47 Thunderbolt and eventually commanding the squadron. He racked up over 100 combat missions. He survived engine failures, flak hits, and the relentless attrition that claimed so many of his friends. He even buzzed his old high school in North Dakota with a borrowed Lend-Lease fighter during a furlough, a flash of the irrepressible Scrappy spirit that the war couldn't quite extinguish. But the day he became an ace in a day remained the anchor point of his narrative. It was the moment the timeline of his life split into, before and after. Decades later, long after the steel planking of Cretville had been pulled up, and the apple orchards had reclaimed the land, Laurence Blumer sat on the wing of a restored P-38 at an air show in Oregon. He was an old man now, his hair white, his face mapped with the wrinkles of 80 years. But the cigar was still there, clamped firmly between his teeth, and the twinkle in his eye hadn't faded. The plane was painted as Scrap Iron 4, complete with the censored nose. People lined up to shake his hand, to ask him what it was like to shoot down 5 planes in 15 minutes. They wanted the movie version. They wanted the glory. It must have been incredible, a young reporter said, pen poised over a notebook. How does it feel to look at those medals now? Blumer looked at the reporter, then looked past him, toward the horizon where the clouds were building up just like they had over France in 1944. He didn't see the crowds or the concession stands. He saw the gray shapes of Focke-Wulfs. He saw the tracers. He felt the crushing weight of the G-forces and the shaking of the yoke in his hands. His eyes misted over, just for a second. "I don't think about the shooting," Blumer said, his voice raspy with age and tobacco. "I think of all my buddies we lost getting them. I think about the guys who didn't get to come home and have a cigar." He patted the aluminum skin of the Lightning, a gesture of affection for a machine that had been his chariot and his shield. The fastest ace in the West climbed down from the wing, moving slowly, leaving the ghost of Scrap Iron 4 to glint in the sun. Laurence Elroy Blumer died in October 1997, taking his final flight not in a cockpit, but in a hospital bed in Springfield. He was buried with military honors, the sound of taps drifting over the cemetery in the Pacific rain. The record books listed his 28 decorations, his 6 aerial victories, and his rank. But to the men who had flown beside him, who had seen him dive alone into a swarm of 40 enemy planes to save his friends, he would always be something more than a statistic. He was Scrappy. And on one brilliant, terrifying afternoon in August, he had owned the sky.